15 armed guards arrived before sunrise, chained the gate, and ordered a quiet widower out of his own house. Behind them stood the woman running the whole operation, smiling as a crooked notary replaced his name on the deed with hers. She thought she was dealing with a lonely old man nobody would ever come looking for. She had no idea he had spent 20 years hunting people exactly like her for the federal government. He handed over his keys without a fight, let her cameras record everything, and walked away without a single word. By sundown, the house she stole would be the reason she lost everything else. Stay until the final ruling, because a stolen deed is about to cost one woman far more than a single house could ever be worth. At 5:40 in the morning, 3 black sport utility vehicles and 2 unmarked trucks rolled to a stop outside a stone house that had belonged to one family for more than 100 years. Its windows still dark, its porch light the only glow along the quiet road. 15 guards in tactical uniforms climbed out in near silence, carrying shields, zip ties, forced entry tools, and cameras clipped to their chests, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before and expected no resistance. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Everett Sloan, walked up the stone path and handed the homeowner a document titled Emergency Property Takeover Order, claiming the Homeowners Association now controlled the house because of an unpaid special assessment of $186,000. Grant Mercer stood in his doorway in a plain flannel shirt, read the paper twice under the porch light, and understood immediately that it was worthless because the association had no legal authority to issue a seizure order of any kind. The house did not even fall within its recognized boundary. One digit of the parcel number had been quietly altered, and the parcel signature stamped across the bottom had been lifted whole from an unrelated public court filing he recognized on sight. Lenora Voss stepped out of her car in a crisp white suit, her heels clicking against the stone path, and announced to the guards' cameras that Grant had abandoned his property and that her security team was simply enforcing the rightful will of the community he had refused to respect. On her command, the guards cut the front lock, tore down the exterior cameras one by one, blocked the long gravel driveway with a truck, seized the living room, and the study sealed his paperwork into boxes, stamped with a fake evidence label, hauled his grandfather's writing desk out into the yard, and staked a metal sign into the lawn declaring the property under association management. Grant did not resist, did not raise his voice, and did not reach for his phone. He only asked Everett, calmly and almost politely, whether the chest cameras were still recording, and Everett, caught slightly off guard by the question, confirmed that they were. Believing she had broken him completely, Lenora demanded the house keys, a signed statement of voluntary departure, and permission for him to leave with only one bag of personal belongings, as though she were doing him a favor. Grant surrendered the keys, but refused to sign anything, folding his arms instead, and letting the silence stretch until it made her uncomfortable. As 2 guards walked him toward the gate, he turned back to look her directly in the eyes and told her in a voice with no anger in it at all that she had just turned a fake civil dispute into a real federal investigation. Lenora laughed at that, a sharp, dismissive sound, and ordered the gate locked behind him without a second glance. He climbed into his old pickup truck, sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, then opened a hidden compartment beneath the dashboard and pulled out an encrypted phone bearing the seal of a federal task force that had officially been disbanded years earlier. He made his first call in 6 years to a woman named Audrey, and when she picked up, he said only that it was time to reactivate a file called Black Acre, and that she should meet him somewhere no camera belonging to Lenora Voss could ever reach. 6 months earlier, in a conversation that now felt like it belonged to a different life entirely, Lenora had offered to buy Grant's house and the 11 acres surrounding it for $1.2 million, sliding the paperwork across a folding table at a community meeting as though it were a gift. Grant had refused without hesitation because the land had belonged to his family for more than a century and carried the only right of access to the shoreline of a nearby lake, a detail that made the property worth far more to certain people than its listed value suggested. A developer named Wade Hollister was quietly planning a $42 million resort behind the community, complete with a private marina and a members-only lodge, but the project could never be approved without a road, running straight through Grant's 11 acres. Wade had promised Lenora $3 million disguised as a consulting fee, a private villa inside the finished resort, a landscaping contract worth $4.6 million, steered toward her sister's company, and enough campaign funding behind the scenes to carry her onto the county board within 2 years. When Grant refused to sell, the association began punishing him with a slow, deliberate campaign of invented fines, $2,500, for a roof that supposedly clashed with the neighborhood pallet, $4,800 for parking his own truck in his own driveway, $7,200 for a row of trees that had stood on the property since before the association even existed, and $18,000 for declining to join a community irrigation system his land was never physically connected to in the first place. Grant mailed back the original county survey proving his house had never once fallen inside the association's legal boundary, attaching a polite note asking that the harassment stop, and Lenora ignored every page of it. Her attorney, a sharp, ambitious woman named Marla Keene, proposed something far bolder during a private meeting in Lenora's office. A forged record showing that a previous owner had voluntarily merged the property into the association 28 years earlier, long before Grant had ever taken title. A notary named Calvin Rourke, desperate for money and easily persuaded, used an expired seal to authenticate the signature of a man who had been dead for nearly a decade, and together the three of them manufactured a fake membership agreement, a fabricated debt, a foreclosure auction that had never actually taken place, a shell company created solely to receive the title, and a brand new deed quietly transferring control of the house to Lenora herself. Grant noticed the irregularities almost immediately, the small inconsistencies in dates, the misspelled clauses copied from other documents, the notary stamp that did not match county records, but he chose not to act right away. He quietly archived every letter, every meeting record, and every invoice they sent him, storing copies in 3 separate locations because he had spent his entire career learning that arresting someone too early only stops one forged document, while allowing a scheme to run its course exposes an entire network of accomplices. Inside the house, she had just seized, standing in the room where Grant used to read in the evenings. Lenora ordered Calvin to change the ownership records that same afternoon, wanting the paperwork finalized before anyone could interfere. Calvin admitted he was nervous, glancing toward the window as though expecting someone to appear, and asked what would happen if the rumors about Grant's government background turned out to be true. Lenora dismissed the concern outright, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly, and told him that a genuinely powerful man would never live in an old house or drive a truck worth $6,000. That real power always looked like hair. She had no idea that every word of that conversation was being captured by a small recording device Grant had deliberately left behind, hidden inside the wall of his own safe. Grant drove to a roadside motel instead of calling the local police, choosing a room with a view of the parking lot and paying in cash because Lenora had connections inside the county government, and he needed his evidence secured before anyone realized he was building a case against her. Audrey Bellamy met him just after dark in an abandoned parking lot behind a shuttered hardware store, a former junior investigator who had once worked directly under him during the years he ran the unit. Grant had led an interagency team that recovered more than $600 million in stolen property over the course of his career, built a fraud detection system called Black Acre that was still quietly used by investigators. Around the country, testified in 47 separate federal cases, and shaped many of the verification procedures that protected land records to this day, before retiring after his wife's death to return alone to the family house where he had grown up. Audrey pulled up the digital filing system on a laptop balanced on the hood of her car, and found that a new deed had already been submitted at 7:12 that morning, less than 2 hours after the guards had first taken the house. That timing alone transformed the crime into wire fraud and federal fraud on a much larger scale, because the filing had traveled through a federally supported system. The payment tied to it had crossed state lines through several different banks. The receiving company used a fabricated tax identification number that did not exist anywhere in the actual registry. Grant's electronic signature had been stolen and reused without his knowledge, and an $8.4 million loan had already been secured against the stolen house within hours of the seizure. Grant asked Audrey to hold off on any arrests for now, so they could trace the money and identify every single participant hiding behind the scheme, and she warned him, her voice tight with concern, that Lenora could demolish the house or sell it off before they finished their work. Grant told her with the faint trace of a smile that the property had quietly been placed inside a federal trust years earlier, meaning anyone attempting to use it as collateral would trigger an automatic review that most ordinary criminals never even knew existed. In other words, Lenora had not simply stolen a house, she had unknowingly tried to defraud a piece of property sitting directly beneath federal oversight, and the system was already watching. When Audrey ran the ownership history of the shell company, now holding the deed scrolling through page after page of linked filings, she found that it already controlled 27 other properties scattered throughout the same community, and Grant realized in that quiet moment that this was not Lenora's first theft, not by a long shot. She had used the identical scheme against other residents who lived alone, people with no children nearby and no family to notice they were gone, then quietly resold their homes to companies connected to Wade for a fraction of their true value. Back at the house, unaware of any of this, Lenora held an emergency association meeting right in the living room she had just occupied, turning the stolen home into what she proudly called a temporary command center and inviting a handful of loyal members to witness her victory over the man who had defied her for months. She ordered every lock in the house replaced. Association banners hung across the front door. Grant's desk dragged out to the garage and left in the rain. His safe pried open with a crowbar. His furniture packed roughly into storage. Crates, survey stakes, driven into the yard to mark the coming road, and a section of the hallway wall torn open. In a frantic search for old ownership papers she was certain still existed somewhere inside. Everett grew uneasy as the day went on, noticing there was no sheriff present, no court officer, and no bank representative anywhere near the operation despite the scale of what they were doing. When he finally asked Marla about the legal authority behind all of it, pulling her aside near the driveway, she reminded him bluntly, without a hint of sympathy, that his company's $900,000 annual contract with the association depended entirely on his continued cooperation. Meanwhile, Calvin sat at the printer in Grant's own study, preparing a second forged version of the deed, one now claiming Grant had sold the property for only $10, and in the deliberately vague language of the document, other valuable considerations never specified. The hidden recorder tucked inside the safe captured every word of it, Lenora openly admitting the debt had never been real, Marla explaining in detail how to avoid signature verification during filing, Calvin demanding a larger cut of the money to keep quiet about what he knew, Wade insisting by phone that the house be demolished within 72 hours to keep the resort timeline intact, and Lenora casually referencing the previous owners. She had already forced out of their homes using the exact same playbook. From a surveillance vehicle parked a safe distance down the road, Grant and Audrey listened to the entire exchange unfold in real time through a pair of earpieces, and Audrey wanted to move in immediately, her hand already reaching for the radio, but Grant asked her to wait until the banking transaction fully cleared, so the money laundering charge would be completely airtight when the moment finally came. Lenora went live to the community that evening from the front porch, standing where Grant used to sit with his coffee, declaring the house had been lawfully reclaimed because its uncooperative former owner had violated his civic obligations to his neighbors. Grant watched the broadcast in silence on a small screen inside the surveillance van, offering no response of any kind, letting her confidence grow completely unchecked and unquestioned. The following afternoon, a member of Wade's team wired $2.5 million into the shell company's account as a formal land deposit, and within seconds the Black Acre system automatically flagged the transfer for review, exactly as it had been designed to do years earlier. Nathaniel Crow, a federal prosecutor with a reputation for patience, called Grant directly that same evening, and said almost with a note of admiration in his voice that they now had fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and theft of property, all documented in one growing file, then asked plainly when. Grant wanted them to finally move in. Grant looked at the live feed still running from inside his own house and told him not yet, because he wanted Lenora to bring in one more person before the trap closed completely around all of them. Lenora announced a celebration at the house the following evening, a formal signing ceremony with Wade meant to prove once and for all that nobody could stand against the association and win. She invited board members loyal to her, Wade's investors, a bank representative, a local news contact, eager for a story, Marla Calvin, and the entire 15-member security team, filling the driveway with cars that had no business being there. She ordered the resort blueprints hung directly on the wall of Grant's family home, right above the fireplace his grandfather had built, showing the house itself erased and replaced by a stone entrance gate and a private boulevard leading toward the lake. Grant approached Everett quietly outside a gas station the next afternoon, not with threats but with copies of his military record and his company's security license laid flat on the hood of the truck between them, pointing out that Lenora had exposed his entire crew to charges of organized trespassing, unlawful confinement, property theft, obstruction of surveillance equipment, and assistance in document fraud, all while carrying weapons throughout the commission of a crime. Everett could lose years of his life and everything he had spent a decade building, and Grant gave him a simple choice: keep following Lenora's orders straight into a federal indictment, or preserve the chest camera footage and cooperate fully with investigators before it was too late. Everett said nothing that night, staring at the papers for a long time before folding them and walking away without a word. But by the next morning, he had secretly backed up every hour of footage from all 15 guards onto a private server, completely outside the association's control, telling no one what he had done. During the ceremony, Lenora signed the transfer agreement with a flourish in front of the cameras and raised a glass of champagne, telling the room that Grant had finally learned his place in the world. Calvin notarized the forged signature live in front of the news contact's camera, while Marla assured the gathered guests that every piece of paperwork was completely airtight, And when the bank representative asked almost as an afterthought why Grant himself was absent from his own home's read-in, Sale Lenora produced a forged power of attorney, claiming he had quietly relocated out of state weeks earlier. The instant she signed the final page, the power in the house cut out, completely plunging the room into darkness for a long, uncomfortable moment. When the large screen behind her flickered back to life, it did not show the resort blueprint she expected, but her own recorded voice, instead calm and matter-of-fact, saying plainly that the debt never needed to be real, only convincing enough for the county to accept it. The guests fell into stunned silence, champagne glasses lowering one by one. And Lenora spun toward the security team and screamed at them to shut it off immediately, but Everett did not move an inch. The gate swung open and Grant walked in alone, dressed in a simple black suit carrying an old leather case that had traveled with him through 47 federal trials. Lenora, her face flushed with panic, ordered the 15 guards to seize him for trespassing on association property, her voice cracking slightly under the strain. None of them moved. Everett set his radio down on the table with a quiet click and announced in front of every guest in the room that his team would follow no further orders without a lawful directive from an actual government authority. Lenora threatened to sue his entire company into the ground, and Grant, unbothered, calmly laid out the original deed, the county survey, the federal trust certification records, proving the house had never once belonged to the association, forensic report confirming every new signature was fake, and a federal preservation order for the property itself, one document at a time across the very table where she had just signed away a house that was never hers. He explained to the stunned guests, his voice steady and unhurried, that Lenora had made the worst possible mistake by targeting his house, specifically because he had personally built the very fraud detection system meant to catch networks exactly like hers, and this property carried extra layers of legal tripwires most people never even knew existed. The moment she had filed the forged deed weeks earlier, the system copied the record automatically, logged the filer's location down to the device, flagged the receiving bank account, cross-referenced every linked company, and reopened every prior transfer that matched the same unmistakable pattern. Grant had never actually lost the house. He had simply allowed Lenora to complete an entire chain of crimes on camera in her own words in front of her own guests. When Marla tried to argue the recordings had been obtained illegally, her voice rising, Grant reminded her calmly that the crimes had occurred inside his own property, and that much of it had been broadcast publicly by Lenora herself to hundreds of viewers. Calvin tried to slip quietly out the back door but found Everett standing there, arms crossed, blocking the only way out. Lenora grabbed the forged deed off the table and tried to tear it into pieces, her hands shaking, and Grant told her almost gently that the original digital record had already been preserved on multiple servers. She would never be able to reach. The sound of a helicopter rose above the roof, its spotlight sweeping across the yard, and outside the gate, a line of federal vehicles rolled in, one after another. Audrey Bellamy stepped down first, followed by Nathaniel Crowe. Then a team of financial agents and uniformed law enforcement officers filing in behind them. Audrey walked straight up to Grant and handed him a thick folder, telling him quietly that it contained lawful search authorizations for 28 properties, 11 bank accounts, and the entire association office. Grant turned back to Lenora, who stood frozen beside the table, and told her that she was now witnessing what a lawful takeover actually looked like. Federal agents secured the house, room by room, but did not arrest Lenora right away because Nathaniel wanted every person involved to choose for themselves in that moment between cooperation and prosecution. Everett handed over 93 hours of chest camera footage without hesitation, along with text messages containing direct orders from Marla payment records, tracing back to the shell company, a list of 27 previous property seizures carried out under the same scheme, an audio recording of Lenora ordering threats against homeowners who refused to leave quietly, and receipts showing forced entry tools purchased directly with association funds meant for community upkeep. 14 of the remaining guards, questioned individually in the driveway, said they had been told every operation carried a valid court order, and several admitted they had asked to see it at some point, but had been reassured by paperwork Lenora herself had provided. Everett accepted responsibility openly for failing to verify the documents independently, and in exchange for his team's full cooperation, prosecutors agreed to consider leniency for the guards who genuinely had not known the true nature of what they were participating in. Calvin turned on Lenora almost immediately once the agents sat him down, revealing in detail that Marla kept pre-prepared forged signature templates ready in a locked drawer, that Lenora paid $25,000 for every falsified deed he produced that Wade personally selected, which vulnerable properties to target next, that the association invented fake fees purely as legal pretext for seizure, and that a county employee had been quietly paid to push the fraudulent filings through the system without any real review. Marla, by contrast, refused to speak another word and immediately requested a lawyer, sitting in silence for the rest of the evening. Wade tried to leave the state quietly on a private plane the next morning, but was stopped before takeoff. Once the $2.5 million deposit was formally tied to the property seizure through the banking records Audrey had already assembled. Lenora insisted, publicly standing on the courthouse steps days later, that she was simply a victim of bad legal advice from Marla. But footage from the chest cameras told a very different story, showing her directly ordering the guards not to care what Grant said and to remove him from the house before the county office even opened that morning. Audrey told Grant, sitting across from him at a quiet diner table weeks into the investigation, that the 27 linked properties were worth nearly $31 million combined, and that several former owners, still alive and still struggling, had lost their savings, their jobs, and their homes to these fake enforcement campaigns over the years. One elderly widow had been living out of her daughter's spare room for 3 years, still believing the collection notices arriving every month were legitimate. A retired mechanic named Walter Pruitt had lost the workshop behind his house, the one he had built with his own hands over 2 decades after Lenora's team claimed it violated a zoning rule that did not exist anywhere in the actual county code. A younger man named Douglas Farrow had signed away his property after guards told him falsely that resisting would result in criminal charges and the loss of his professional license. Each of these stories, gathered one by one over the following weeks, became part of a growing case file that Nathaniel privately began calling the largest coordinated property theft his office had ever prosecuted. Inside Lenora's office, agents searching through a locked filing cabinet found a handwritten list titled Cleanup List with Grant's name written at the very bottom of the page, followed by a short dismissive note describing him as low risk, living alone, and without influence. Grant read the note slowly when Audrey showed it to him, then looked up and said quietly that it was exactly that kind of contempt for other people, that casual assumption that no one would ever fight back, that had finally written her own conviction for her. Lenora was granted temporary release weeks later, after her lawyer argued successfully that there was no realistic flight risk given her ties to the community. Almost immediately upon release, she used what little influence she had left to fight back with everything she had. She held a public statement outside the courthouse, her voice sharp with rehearsed outrage, accusing Grant of staging the entire takeover from the beginning, planting illegal recording devices throughout his own home, using old government connections purely for personal revenge, threatening association board members behind closed doors, manipulating digital evidence to fit his narrative, and sabotaging a project that would have brought real jobs to the probably local economy for years to come. Several county officials who had quietly taken money from Wade over the years began pressuring the prosecutor's office behind the scenes to back away from the case entirely, worried about what further digging might expose about themselves. Marla, working from her cell with borrowed resources, filed a motion demanding that all evidence gathered inside the house be thrown out entirely, arguing that once the new deed had been recorded, Grant no longer legally owned the property and therefore had no right to have placed a recording device inside it in the first place. Grant recognized this immediately as a genuinely dangerous legal argument, because if the court gave any temporary validity whatsoever to a forged deed, it could put a significant portion of the evidence at real risk. Working closely with Nathaniel late into several nights, he built a careful and thorough rebuttal, establishing that a document created through forged signatures could never legally transfer ownership under any circumstance, that Grant had never voluntarily surrendered the property at any point, that the guards had entered using fraudulent paperwork they were never entitled to rely on, that Lenora had no reasonable expectation of privacy while broadcasting herself publicly to hundreds of viewers, that the chest cameras themselves belonged to the security company rather than to Grant, personally, that the banking records had been obtained under a completely separate and valid warrant, and that several key confessions had occurred in front of independent witnesses with no connection to Grant whatsoever. Everett agreed to testify despite renewed threats from Lenora's remaining allies to destroy his company entirely, and Audrey discovered digging through updated banking records that after her release, Lenora had wired $600,000 into a foreign account, a direct and serious as-attested violation of her release conditions that no one had caught until then. At the same time, Grant learned through a quiet tip that members of Wade's team were preparing to burn down a storage facility holding the original ownership records of every homeowner who had ever been forced out under the scheme. Rather than confront them himself, which would have put him at unnecessary risk, he alerted federal agents immediately, who arrived in time to catch 2 men in the very act of pouring accelerant around the building's foundation. One of them admitted under questioning, eager to reduce his own sentence, that the order to burn the records had come directly from Lenora over the phone just hours earlier. At the next hearing, Nathaniel played the recorded call for the entire courtroom, Lenora's own voice instructing someone without hesitation to burn everything before Grant could bring it into court. Judge Rosalind Pike listened to the recording without expression, then immediately revoked Lenora's release on the spot. Lenora was handcuffed right there in the courthouse hallway, in front of the very cameras she had once invited into Grant's stolen home to help destroy his reputation months earlier. Lenora, Marla, Calvin, and Wade eventually stood trial together under one sweeping conspiracy, though each faced separate and specific charges tailored to their individual roles, including conspiracy to commit property fraud, bank fraud, wire, fraud deed, forgery, money laundering, organized trespassing, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, witness intimidation, and use of force to seize property from its rightful owners. Calvin, already cooperating, accepted a formal plea deal and testified against Lenora directly on the stand, confirming under oath that she had personally applied the notary seal to the documents after being clearly warned that the underlying signature was fake. Everett described in careful detail the morning 15 guards descended on the house before dawn, and the footage played for the jury showed Grant offering no resistance at any point, making no threats of any kind, and repeatedly asking, calmly, to see a valid court order that never existed. Audrey presented a full financial map stretching across the courtroom screen, tracing money from the association's reserve fund into the shell company, and from there, directly into personal accounts controlled by Lenora, Marla, and Wade, individually. A series of former homeowners, several of them elderly and visibly nervous in front of the courtroom, took the stand one after another and described how Lenora had used fabricated debts, aggressive legal threats, and armed guards to push them out of homes they had lived in for decades. Walter Pruitt described standing in his own driveway while strangers carried his tools out to a truck, unable to reach anyone at the county who could tell him whether any of it was legal. Douglas Farrow told the jury that he still checked the locks on his rented apartment 3 times every night, a habit he had picked up in the weeks after guards first appeared at his door. Their testimony, delivered plainly, and without exaggeration, did more to move the jury than any financial chart Audrey had prepared, because it made the abstract numbers into real people sitting only a few feet away. When Grant himself finally testified sitting calmly with his hands folded, Marla tried one last time to paint him as a bitter former federal agent who had deliberately baited Lenora into committing a crime out of resentment. Grant answered simply without raising his voice, that he had not created the forged paperwork himself, had not hired 15 armed men to storm anyone's home, had not moved a single dollar of stolen money through hidden accounts, and had done nothing more than decline to stop the 4 daughters. Defendant from recording her own decisions in her own words. Marla pressed him further, asking pointedly why he had not simply called local police that first morning when the guards arrived. Grant explained patiently that calling the police might have stopped one act of trespassing that single day, but would never have exposed the 27 prior seizures hidden behind it. So he had chosen instead to preserve every piece of evidence and let trained federal investigators handle the matter properly from the ground up. The most damaging piece of evidence in the entire trial came from the deed Lenora had tried to tear apart during the failed signing ceremony months earlier, when a forensic document examiner testified that the signature attributed to Grant on that page had actually been copied from a sworn affidavit he had filed in a sealed federal case 14 years prior. That single detail meant Lenora had not simply forged one homeowner's signature out of thin air. She had reproduced a signature lifted from a document that should never have left a secured federal file at all, proving conclusively that someone inside the county office had been feeding Marla protected material for years. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every major charge against all 4 defendants. Judge Rosalind Pike told the packed courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner, that the defendant had transformed a residents' association into an organized instrument of theft against the very people it claimed to serve. She stated plainly that the court intended not only to punish Lenora personally, but to dismantle entirely the system she had spent years building to make such theft possible in the first place. Lenora received a lengthy federal prison sentence and was permanently barred from ever running a homeowners association, community fund, or real estate business again in any capacity. Every asset traced back to the scheme, including her villa, her investment accounts, and personal property purchased with stolen money, was seized in full and turned over for restitution to her victims. She was ordered to pay damages jointly with her co-defendants to every family she had harmed, forfeited the $3 million she had been promised by Wade for her cooperation in the scheme, and faced additional tax penalties on income the investigation proved was entirely illegal from the start. Marla lost her license to practice law permanently and received her own separate prison sentence for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and her once thriving law firm was placed under strict financial oversight to ensure no further sepultur d'actionos misuse of client trust funds occurred. Wade's $42 million resort project was suspended indefinitely and never resumed his land holdings, and linked accounts were frozen solid. And his company was ultimately forced to liquidate significant assets to help repay the victims of a scheme he had funded quietly from the very beginning. The Homeowners Association itself was placed under the control of an independent, court-appointed supervisor within weeks, and every board member who had remained loyal to Lenora throughout the ordeal was removed from their position immediately and barred from serving again. The association's remaining reserve fund, combined with the various seized assets, was used to return 27 homes, or their fair equivalent value to the families who had lost them over the years, refund every fabricated fee ever unjustly charged, cover the victims' mounting legal costs, repair homes that had been damaged or gutted during the seizures, and provide meaningful compensation for the financial and emotional toll the entire scheme had caused each family. Grant's house was returned to him immediately and without condition, with the association ordered to pay in full for every wall lock and piece of furniture that had been destroyed or removed during the occupation. Everett was allowed to keep his company after his complete and early cooperation, but he chose to resign anyway and hand full control over to a partner with a clean record, later driving out to visit Grant in person, simply to apologize to face for what he had allowed to happen. Grant did not excuse what Everett had done that morning, and told him so plainly, but he acknowledged quietly that when the final choice had finally arrived, Everett had made the right one when it mattered most. Everett later took a position teaching ethics and legal compliance to newly licensed security contractors, telling each new class that the worst mistake of his career had been trusting a client's paperwork over his own judgment, and that no contract was ever worth what he had nearly lost. Years later, one of his former guards would tell him the story of that morning was still used as a training example, a reminder that following orders was never an excuse for looking away from the truth standing right in front of you. When Grant returned home for good, walking through the front door for the first time as its rightful owner again, he removed the association's sign from his front door with his own hands and placed it inside a box alongside the rest of the case, evidence refusing to let the house become a trophy or a symbol of personal victory over anyone. Instead, in the months that followed, Grant founded a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping adults who had been targeted by homeowners associations and investment companies using fraudulent paperwork to seize their homes, offering the kind of quiet, patient guidance he wished someone had offered those 27 families years earlier. Audrey asked him over coffee one afternoon to return formally as an advisor to a newly formed task force, and Grant agreed on the single condition that the unit focus first on stopping these schemes before victims lost everything, rather than only prosecuting the wreckage left behind afterward. Within the first year, the nonprofit helped 4 separate families recover homes taken through nearly identical schemes in neighboring counties using the same document tracing methods Grant had built decades earlier. Walter Pruitt eventually rebuilt his workshop with materials donated by volunteers who had read about his case, and he sent Grant a photograph of the finished building with a short note thanking him for believing an old mechanic's story mattered. Douglas Farrow found steady work again and stopped checking his locks 3 times a night, though he still kept a folder of his old paperwork close at hand just in case anyone ever came asking again. Months later, Grant stood at his gate in the quiet stillness of another sunrise, the tire tracks from the security convoy long since faded from the gravel, the broken hallway wall fully repaired, and his name once again listed correctly in the bated, plain black ink on the county's property records. In a federal prison far away, Lenora received her final asset statement through the mail, informing her that the villa she once bragged about at every gathering had been sold off to help repay the very people she had pushed out of their own homes over the years. The house she had once believed would open the door to a $42 million fortune had instead, in the end, taken away absolutely everything she had ever owned or believed she controlled. Grant closed the gate quietly behind him, looked out over the land that remained exactly as his family had left it a century earlier, and said to no one but the empty morning air. That power was never measured by how many people someone could send to another person's door, but by which side the truth stood on once it finally walked into the room.